So we have someone from either side on the pod to talk about probably the two most exhausting managers to watch on the touchline. Manchester City correspondent Sam Lee and our Arsenal writer Art de Roche. Art, I'm going to start with you. Is he the prodigal son?
To be fair, I feel like a lot of people kind of marked him as that because he went straight from Manchester City to Arsenal, but a lot of people forgot the managers he'd kind of worked under before then. Obviously, Arsene Wenger being a big one, but also David Moyes. And I think you've seen traces of all those managers in this Arsenal team since he took over 3 years ago. So when people kind of make that Pep Arteta comparison and just leave it there, it always feels kind of almost like you're just scratching the surface a little. And you've seen sometimes they're really happy to defend deep as a team. Sometimes they're very almost anti-Pep in a way. But I feel like obviously with it being Manchester City coming up, obviously those comparisons are going to come, and they also have quite similar ideas anyway. So yeah, it's a fair statement, but I also think that people do forget that other managers have influenced him as well.
Yeah. Does it go on? Does it annoy you a bit? Well, you said it doesn't. It only scratches the surface. Does it annoy you a bit when people kind of just go off this kind of face level comparisons, but actually there's more thoughts? Because the reason I'm asking that is because stuff like that really annoys me. So it could be a really good podcast. This.
Can I just point out that I do deal in more than just the base level sometimes.
Not you.
No, yeah, I wasn't. That answer wasn't like pointed at you, Mark.
No, I tell you what annoys me, Art. Correspondents coming on this pod and accusing me of base level questions. That's what annoys me. Go on, Art.
But I think it's just more how I guess the general perspective is, I'd say, rather than just going off that question.
No, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Because
it's the same with Pep. It's like, oh, is he arrogant? Is he overthinking? It's like, well, just look at what's happened in the last few games.
Yeah,
and then we'll get there.
In a way, it is a little bit annoying, especially when it comes to Arsenal, because when I look at this Arsenal team, I see a lot of shades of the early kind of Emirates era under Arsene Wenger. So around 2010, that kind of time when they had Fabregas, Nasri, Arshavin, those guys, I see a lot of kind of similarities. So for people to kind of not see that sometimes is annoying, but obviously not everyone is going to see those kind of comparisons because they weren't really focusing on Arsenal at the time. So yeah, it is a little bit annoying, but I get why people do it.
I want to talk about the specific tactics of this match a little bit later on, which if you actually are going to end up listening to this podcast after the game has taken place, could be a very, very interesting discussion that we have pre-match when you listen.
That'll show up a few people, won't it?
Yeah, we'll work it. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. This first part of the podcast, though, it's on the two managers, their relationship, their personalities, and so on and so forth. How do you think, Sam, Pep has been both personally and professionally since Mikel Arteta left? Because he had a massive role at City.
Yeah, so I think probably one of the most pertinent things, and I guess Arsenal fans would have known this if, when they'd read profiles of Arteta when he took over. But one of the things that Guardiola kind of has always had, and therefore needs in the system, is somebody who, when he's out on the touchline and he's kind of scratching his head or his chin, and first 5 minutes going, what's going on here? And he's processing it himself. He wants to go back to his bench and sit down, and somebody who's his assistant to say, this is what I think. And he's go, oh yeah, you're right. And then we'll change this and we'll change that. He always had that with Dominic Torrent. And then he had that with Arteta when Torrent left. And then when Arteta left midway through that 1920 season, he didn't have it. So they went and got Juan Marleo, who obviously, who Pep worked with him forever, and they're on the same page about everything. He did columns for The Athletic during the World Cup, and they were very entertaining, kind of Guardiola-like in his thoughts and that kind of thing. I don't know, maybe it's something he needs now. But Arteta is one of those people who was on the same wavelength as him. And in that season, when City were already struggling, it certainly didn't make matters any easier when Guardiola didn't have that. So it kind of needed Juan Marleo and the Fernandinho and the dressing room to help reboot the last great City that have won the last 2 titles, but there was a bit of a period of difficulty after Arteta. And I suppose it's only this season, really, that they've come on the radar as challengers. There was a game at the Etihad at the start of last season where City won easily. They scored 5. Xhaka got sent off. It was something like that. I saw a stat this morning that City have won the last 10 games against Arsenal in the Premier League. Like, you don't assume that's how it is because of how this season has been. But yeah, so it's only this season, really, in terms of, demeanour and attitude, that Arteta's really had anything to do with it. I'm sure Guardiola's probably a bit happier that it's not Liverpool and Klopp that are at the top. But as he was kind of as he's saying all the time, but as he said in his press conference yesterday, what he wants is for his team to fight for the title all the way. And it doesn't matter if it's Arteta or anyone else. And I noticed Arteta said the same thing about Pep.
Yeah, the other thing that one of the things that I was told quite early on is that Arteta was a very useful conduit to get to Pep. So if you wanted to put a presentation to Pep or an idea to Pep within the City organisation, then Arteta was quite a useful man in, well, maybe you need to phrase it like this, or this is the best time to, and that understanding of Guardiola actually benefited the organisation. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. Yeah, you should have answered your own question. That was better than what I said. So yeah, because the thing is, so when Juan Marleo came in, and since he's left, so Juan Marleo, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when Cancelo left. Cancelo gets a bit grumpy when he's not playing, to put it mildly. But Juan Marleo was always the kind of conduit between them. And now he's gone. There was no one to really fix that. Now Leo's gone. There's no one to really fix that. But now obviously Cancelo's gone. So that kind of highlights that. And that's another thing that Guardiola did need without Arteta being there, because Guardiola's just so intense. Like, the players don't all necessarily like him. But, they've got professional pride. And when I mentioned Fernandinho and the other players, that was because a couple of years ago, they got themselves together and were like, right, lads, come on, we need to get this together. They won the league. They got to the Champions League final. But a lot of them wanted to go because they were a bit tired of Pep. So you do need that kind of middleman. But then again, that's not to say that Pep's terrible at this or Arteta's great at that, because there's managers and assistant coaches up and down the land, all over the world, where you need the assistant to be a bit closer to the players because the manager is a bit more unreachable. That's completely normal, but it's not something that City have always had, and it's definitely something that Arteta was good at. But again, I'm sure he's got his assistants at Arsenal that do the old Arteta job for him, because he's going to be the intense, heavy one that the Arsenal players can't really relate to, so they need an arm around the shoulder from somebody else.
That's a good point on Arteta's backroom staff, isn't it, Art? Actually, he's got what I would call quite a eclectic mix of assistants, actually, but maybe quite necessary in regards, in terms of experience, where they've worked in the past, and by bringing them all together, they're quite a complete unit. His backroom staff.
Yeah, you've got obviously Steve Round and Albert Stuyvenberg, who are very experienced. Have been coaches at Everton, Manchester United under Louis van Gaal for Stuyvenberg. And then you've got the flip side of that with a guy like Carlos Cuesta, who's still only 26, 27 years old, but has still got a lot of experience and is someone who can probably speak to the players on more of a level, because not just because he's close in age, but also if people remember the Amazon documentary, there are a few scenes of him basically almost giving them a pep talk before a game, showing them, reminding them what their strengths are, in little one-to-one kind of meetings. I think in one of his sessions, he might have called Ben White, or said Ben White's best quality was his ability to learn. And it's little things like that that I think can get you as a player in a better mindset. Whereas if you didn't have, I guess, the support of a coach, let alone the manager, because we all know clubs are much deeper than just the manager. I think that goes a long way. And as Sam mentioned, and you mentioned, Mark, Arteta's probably quite similar to Pep now in that it's a different job that he's doing. There are different demands. So he will probably be a bit less kind of like the middleman that he was at Manchester City, and a bit more demanding, as we've seen with his non-negotiables and how those have worked over the past 3 years.
Are they? Do you think Do you think both men are proud of their associations with each other?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking from, I guess, the Arsenal Arteta side, what has stood out when Pep has spoken about Arteta is it goes back to when he was a player, calling him when Barcelona and Bayern Munich had English opposition in the Champions League and asking for tips and stuff like that. And I think if you're getting that kind of base level of recognition from someone who you've looked up to since you were a kid in the Barcelona youth academy, La Masia, then I can only assume the pride is going to be there forever. But I also think from Arteta's standpoint, the fact that he's been able to actually compete in games, mostly in the cup competitions against Pep, and as well the New Year's Day game last season where Arsenal were quite unlucky to throw the game away. But yeah, I think the fact that he has competed in certain games also helps in that regard.
Yeah, and also just in terms of Pep speaking about Arteta, then obviously it goes back to when they were playing, or Arteta was playing. But his praise of Arteta's work at Arsenal has gone back to when Arsenal, when lots of Arsenal fans wanted him to leave, when they weren't top of the table. So it's always been completely genuine. And then obviously from Arteta's side, it's Pep Guardiola. Right? You've worked with it. I mean, I'm sure he would have admired him anyway as a coach. He then worked with him for 3 or 4 years and saw it all up close. How you get a group of talented players with huge egos and expectations to do what you want them to do. Fundamentally, from a coaching point of view, that's all you need them to do. But it's never that simple. He's seen that up close. It's Guardiola. He's done it forever in his career. The more people say, when I asked earlier on about, do you get annoyed about these kind of things? I've got myself annoyed. The more people say, oh, well, he's won. It's like these listed titles that he's won over the last 12 years. It's almost like he's had it too easy. It's like, that's how good he is. Like, nobody else is doing this. And Arteta has seen that close up. And I did Sky Sports News this morning, and there was an article, and it said, Arteta's sick of being seen as like the protege. I think he's just sick of being asked about it, because I think he's always going to respect that Guardiola link, and he's always going to cherish those opportunities to go into coaching. And Guardiola and City didn't stand in his way when he wanted to leave, and he'll respect that. I think he's just sick of being asked about it now, because they're top of the league. Yeah. When we go into press conferences, we sometimes, if Arsenal play in City and it's, the 10 defeats in a row Arsenal that we were talking about earlier, you think, as a journalist, how are we going to, what's the talking point here? You go, oh, well, it's Arteta and Pep, so we'll ask him about that. We don't need to do that now. They're top of the league. We don't need to find extra stories around it. This is the story.